Okay, so before I get to the questions that I have sent to me, does anybody here have any questions? Yeah.
Familiar with Arianism, but can you summarize modalism?
Yeah. So modalism, and a modern version of this is the Oneness Pentecostals. They believe this. It's a denial of the Trinity that recognizes the words Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but what they'll say is those are not distinct persons. So they're not tritheists. They're the opposite extreme. They're going to say those are just modes of his existence. Here's the best way to think about it, even though a modalist probably wouldn't appreciate me saying it like this. But it's roughly the way they see it on the storyboard of the Bible going from left to right. The Father, that was the Old Testament God. That was God in the Old Testament. They wouldn't say that was the Old Testament God. That would be more like a liberal. But they would say that was God in the Old Testament. And then, in the New Testament, right about Matthew 1:1, he jumps into the Superman booth, and then he puts on the Son suit. And then, at Pentecost, he jumps into the Superman booth, and he puts on the Holy Spirit suit. Now, they would not like me saying it like that, but that's pretty much what they're saying. These are not three distinct persons, but these are modes of his existence. So they want to deny, and sometimes you'll hear from them, especially in their, because modalists in the first couple centuries were sophisticated philosophically. Modalists now, and I'm not making fun of them, but it's just a fact. Oneness Pentecostals, usually it's maybe things that might even get us tripped up from time to time. You read a verse, and I've never understood this. It blows my mind. I gotta be really nice when I respond to someone who says this, because you'll hear them say, "Well, then why is Jesus speaking to the Father in John 17 or something like that? Or why is the dove doing this and the voice is from heaven?" And I'm like, that's our line. Exactly. Like, they'll see that and their brain goes in reverse. Like, it's a reason to see that they're distinct persons. But they see it and they say, well, who's he talking to? I guess is the hurdle in their mind. Early modalists wouldn't have made that mistake. They would simply say that these are modes of his existence, and they're going to shift the conversation as to why to philosophical reasons, similar to what we looked at, which is that God is simple. He is one. He can't be composed of parts. And so what they see, and we agree with that, they see the persons. Well, how are those not things? And we'll get a chance to look at that. How is there one in essence, and yet these are real distinctions between persons? And that's a great question. That's not simple. That's tougher. Okay, so those are the early modalists would say it like that. A second question? Yes.
Are there other variations of how people see the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit besides modalists?
The leading one would be subordinationism, which will be the opposite error. The extreme opposite error is tritheism. So I'm kind of leaving that aside because, of course, tritheism is a form of polytheism. And Finn mentioned this the first week, and I don't know why it slipped my mind. It was a good point. Here we are in Idaho. I should have thought of it. Mormonism is, of course, polytheistic. But, when you ask the question, how does this show up today? Well, tritheism, for some reason, I was thinking of other things. I was like, afterwards, I'm like, oh yeah, duh, Mormonism. So that's, but the trick about Mormonism is that it's more like henotheism and polytheism and atheism all rolled into one. Because philosophically it's atheism, because they believe that there's an infinite regress of gods who were once as we are and we could become as he is. And Elohim is just the God with whom we do business with. And henotheism is sort of like a local deity kind of thing. So that's so out there that I don't even know where to classify it here because it falls under different categories. Tritheism, as it was held in the early centuries, was quickly recognized to not be a Christian option because it was just so clear throughout the Christian scriptures, and the Jewish scriptures are Christian scriptures, and that there is one God, that there is only one God. And so tritheism fell out of favor as an option well before Nicaea. So when I talk about the extremes, at Nicaea and afterwards, I'm more talking about modalism versus subordinationism. So having described modalism, subordinationism would be where Christ the Son is subordinate to the Father, not just in his human nature and in his mission, because that's biblical. He is subordinate in his human nature and in his mission, therefore his kingdom. You think of verses like 1 Corinthians 11:2 and 15:28. Those two verses can trip people up if they don't make distinctions between the human nature and his mission versus the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in eternity. And that's why Orthodox theologians came up with the distinction, which at first just sounds like, man, these guys had way too much time on their hands. But no, it's actually important, is the distinction between the ontological Trinity and the economic Trinity. And I'll put it like that, high and low, for this reason. Not two different Trinities, two senses of or perspectives on the Trinity. The ontological Trinity, ontos, his being, this is the view of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as God is in eternity. There's distinction. But that distinction is what we called, and this is really hard, and we'll get into this starting next week, the relation of origin. Okay, the three persons, and what makes them Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I'm using cheating language everywhere, makes them and stuff like that, and it's just the limits of human language. Down here, the economic Trinity, oikos in the Greek is house. It's where we get the English word economics. But there, all it means is the order of the works of God in creation, but we especially focus on salvation. And there, the Son is subordinate to the Father. So that would be accurate about the economic Trinity and with respect to his human nature. It gets harder when you talk about, well, what's the nature of the order in the ontological Trinity? And that's a great question, and it's not easy. And when we don't think about these things, you can get new versions of subordinationism, like one of the questions I got, which is sometimes called the Eternal Subordination of the Son, ESS for short, or sometimes it'll be called EFS, the Eternal Functional Subordination. And that is a debate that started to erupt in 2016. It was there already because and these are not liberal theologians, these are conservative theologians, mostly Baptist, and that's not to pick on Baptists, but they are Wayne Grudem and Bruce Ware and others who were trying to ground gender roles, authority and submission, as a reflection of something happening in the Trinity. And we talked about this in week 1, that there's a sense in which you can make analogies as long as you keep the order right. That, here's the way I always say it, is I'm answering their question already. Maybe I'll just wait to get to that question so you see what's going on there. But hopefully that's clear about what subordinationism is that the Son is subordinate to the Father in the eternal relationship. And there they don't just mean he's number 2 when I say them. They mean that he is responding to the Father's authority and obeying in things in the eternal relationship. And that becomes a subordination of his being. And they'll deny that. They'll say, no, I'm not subordinating his being. I'm just saying that he willingly submits to the Father. And I'll talk about that in a second as to why that's problematic. But that's subordinationism in a nutshell. A little bit more sophisticated in some ways than modalism, even. Any third question? And the first person who asks something off the topic that's why there's the pressure, because nobody's done it yet. But But just to tell you, you can, this week or the weeks to come. There you go. But if not, let me just break out those couple of questions. And the first one was, and I kind of got into it already, what is this idea of the eternal subordination of the Son? Oh man, and there's so much that can go wrong with the whole debate. Even the guys that are on the right side, some people who are on the right side may be for some wrong reasons, which is going to do what that always does. It's going to co-opt, through bad ideas, they're going to co-opt the right ideas and make a new generation of right-thinking young men gravitate to right ideas in wrong ways, which will then go wrong, and it'll wind up being wrong ideas. But sorry about that, but it'll happen. So what is this eternal subordination of the Son? Beyond what I already said, here's the difference in a nutshell, because there's things I've said, things we've said already, that it might be hard to tell the difference. We've talked about the Son subordinating his kingdom. You see that in 1 Corinthians 15:28 I mentioned. That on the last day that he will give up the kingdom, I'm paraphrasing here, to the Father, that the Father will put all things under his feet, Christ's. But when I say that, Paul's saying, I'm accepting from that the Father. The Father will still be above him? What's going on there? And of course, the answer is that it's talking about the human nature of Christ and Christ as his anointed king. Okay, so that's a way to explain that. Okay, but I've also mentioned the origin of relations last week, that the Son is of the Father. And we'll really start talking about this next week with eternal generation. The Son is of the Father, light from light, very God of God, very God. When you hear those words, the Son is of the Father, there is a one and two-ness. So what's the difference between what we're saying and what this eternal subordination of the Son is saying? Here's the difference. The idea is, in that idea of ESS, is that there is an idea of primacy and hierarchy, not just in their relation, father to son, son to father, but as a being, as God is in himself, not with respect to what's proper to their persons, but that the being of the Son is below the being of the Father. And at this point, they will go up in arms and say, no, that's not what we're saying. Because they would recognize that as Arianism. It's exactly what we've described Arianism as, that the Son is less in being. Now, they can say, unlike the Arians, they can say, no, the Arians said, there was when he was not, the Son. So the Arians are clearly saying that the Son was created. The ESS doctrine, and here's part of what makes it so subtle, we're not saying that. The Son is uncreated. He is God. And so they will affirm every line of Nicaea, very God of very God. But they will say that there are some things that the Son does in obedience to the Father in their eternal relationship. It's not being, it's not his essence that's lower or that's subordinate. It's some things he willingly does. Question: these some things, are they things or non-things? You understand my question? So they want to say, no, we're not saying the Son is lower in being. By the way, things is just a synonym for being. What's a being? It's a thing. It's something, right? And so they say, no, we're not saying the Son is less in being. There's just some things, beings, the Son willingly does in response to the Father. So, this is tough. This is hard stuff. But that, in a nutshell, is what it is. And so, for whatever reason, Bruce Ware and Wayne Grudem have been the two that have gotten the most flack for it. And Bruce Ware's book, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is written back in 2005, where he draws out a bunch of things that he will argue. Look in John's Gospel. The Father sends the Son. The Son is willing to be sent. He was willing before he was sent. End of story. And if he's willing and he's a distinct person, there's a distinct will. And that's another issue here. Are there three wills or one will? Of course there's three wills. There's three persons. What's a person without a separate will? That makes it even harder. In fact, that's harder than the other part. We'll come back to this week after week. But it gives you a sense. Wayne Grudem said flatly at that time, quote, "I hold to the eternal submission of the Son to the Father." And you read that, and you're like, he means eternal agreement. He means, those kind of things. He means that the Son is perfectly willing to go and be incarnate. We'd all agree with that. So what? What's the problem? So it's a big debate, but that in a nutshell is what it's about. And because this is attempting to ground gender roles that are conservative and what's called complementarian. Does that word mean anything to anybody? Complementarianism. So there's a debate between complementarianism and egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is a little bit more familiar. That's sort of pressing the equality idea. And it could be in politics, economics, or gender roles. And complementarianism is saying, oh no, we're not all the way on the other side. We're not patriarchalists or hierarchalists. We're middle of the road. We're saying that God created men and women, they don't want to say different, complementary to each other. And so I would say that view doesn't even go far enough. But anyway, sorry, I'm bringing all that up to say, the reason this is coming up is because they're trying to make gender roles a certain thing and ground that in the Trinity. So what's the problem? Well, the guys that have the right view, some of them, I won't mention names, even though somebody at the question wants me to, I'll get to her next week. Amy Bird wants to ground the opposite view in the right view of the Trinity. Wants to ground egalitarianism. Now, she'll probably deny being an egalitarian, I would think. So I want to be fair, but she wants to criticize the complementarian view as patriarchal, which is kind of laughable because they were driven by avoiding being, they were just a bunch of nice boys that wanted to not be accused of being patriarchal. But it's like, man, what does the Trinity have to do with that? Well, we'll see it. So that's all I'm going to say on that until Joseph and Ethan get back here and, they can't ask me questions like that and then, not be here. They're going to be partly responsible for this. But anyway, any other questions? Then I can wrap up. All right, that's where I'll end it tonight, and we'll do the